The first thing Dr. Li Wei noticed and the Horanqi appeared was the smell strange, acrid, and unnervingly organic. It was a mixture of wet earth, rotting vegetation, and something metallic that made his stomach lurch. He had seen the scanned data, of course everyone had. But nothing prepared him for the real thing. A small, grotesque shape slithered out from beneath the translucent dome of the agriculture station. The thing looked almost soft, like some kind of crawling jellyfish with an inner core of pulsing light. The iridescent green hue was so vibrant it practically glowed against the deep blue sky of Akapu, a planet that, until recently, humans had thought of as a quiet, uninhabited paradise. But in the last week, that illusion had shattered. Li Wei adjusted his glasses, watching the creature writhe and stretch in the center of a cultivated crop bed. "Should we contain it?" asked Charlotte Vance, a geologist standing beside him. Her tone was detached, the kind of professionalism that only came after working in a crisis zone for too long. Li Wei frowned. "It's unusual. We need more data. Don't rush this." But before he could finish his thought, the ground beneath them began to tremble. At first, it was subtle, like a far-off rumble. Then the shaking intensified. A second Horanqi emerged from the ground, followed by a third. And a fourth. Then, in a violent eruption of movement, the crop bed was consumed. The creatures were multiplying too quickly, too aggressively. "What in God's name?" Charlotte began, but her words were drowned out by the thundering sound of more creatures rising from the ground. The crops were being overrun by pulsating masses of rapidly growing organic material. The once pristine soil had become an undulating mess of gooey, green life. The workers scrambled. The team's communication devices crackled as the agricultural director, Simon Drake, shouted into his earpiece, demanding answers. "It's not just spreading, it's..." Li Wei started, but before he could finish, one of the larger creatures lunged forward, opening its translucent body like an alien flower and releasing a small cloud of spores into the air. A sickeningly sweet scent filled the atmosphere, making Li Wei cough involuntarily. "Contain the air. Seal the dome." Simon's voice boomed, but there was no stopping the cascade. Within moments, the fields were swarmed with Horanqi, their shapes shifting and mutating as they adapted to their surroundings with terrifying speed. Li Wei had studied the creatures for months before their arrival. Their biology was far beyond anything he had encountered on Earth. The way they reproduced wasn't like any known species. The Horanqi didn't follow the normal cycles of reproduction, they simply emerged when they detected a new source of organic material. And humans? Humans, it seemed, were the perfect catalyst for their rapid growth. "Shut down the agriculture dome," Charlotte ordered, her hands flying over the control panels, but even as she spoke, the Horanqi spread. They adapted. They were faster, more intelligent than they had realized. Li Wei watched as the green masses infiltrated the agricultural systems. Their ability to mutate, to adjust and evolve almost instantaneously, made them an unprecedented threat. The crops were gone. The water supply was tainted. The atmosphere was becoming suffused with spores. For a brief moment, Li Wei was paralyzed by the realization that nothing could contain them. He had always viewed himself as a problem solver, as someone who could find patterns in chaos, but here on this alien world he felt utterly powerless. This was no ordinary infestation, he realized. This was an invasion. The commotion from the agriculture dome quickly spread throughout the colony. News of the Horanqi's explosion across the fields reached every corner of the human settlement, and within hours, the high command at the colony control center was in an uproar. Li Wei found himself summoned to a meeting, alongside the colony's leadership, Dr. Simon Drake, the cynical ecologist, Charlotte Vance, the aggressive geologist, and Faris Kadir, the political advisor who had always preferred to focus on the practicalities of colonization rather than the subtleties of science. "This is your mess, Li," Simon Drake growled, staring across the conference table at him. "You said the planet was stable. You said it was safe." Li Wei winced. He had said that. He had been so sure of it, so confident that Akapu's ecosystem was mostly compatible with human life. He had focused on the surface data, the surface readings. But he had never anticipated the Horanqi. This isn't a failure of the ecosystem. It's something else, Li Wei began, choosing his words carefully. We triggered something. These creatures, this biological system was dormant before we arrived. And now, he trailed off, trying to make sense of what was happening. What do you mean we triggered something? Faris Kadir interjected, his tone impatient. We've been here for 2 years, and we haven't seen anything like this until now. Are you telling me that you somehow activated them? We need a real solution, not some biobabble, Li. It's not biobabble, Li Wei shot back, his voice sharp. These creatures, they aren't just pests. They're part of the planet's natural order. We've seen their ability to adapt, to evolve in response to new environmental pressures. And now that we've introduced agriculture, human technology, and, most importantly, our own biological presence, well, the system is responding. Responding? Simon spat. These things are overrunning our crops, our buildings. We can't let them respond all over our colony. We need to eradicate them now. Li Wei didn't flinch at the words. Eradication. It was always the first instinct. Always the easiest route. But was it the right one? We can't just destroy them without understanding how they work, Li Wei said, his voice calmer now. If we do that, we risk destroying the entire ecosystem of Akapu. We need to study them. We need to understand them. The room fell silent. Charlotte Vance, who had been uncharacteristically quiet during the conversation, spoke up then, her voice tinged with the gravity of the situation. Li's right. If we just wipe them out, we might be cutting off something much larger than we realize. There's a balance here. We don't know the long-term consequences. Faris Kadir's expression darkened. Are you suggesting we just sit back and let them destroy everything we've built? The people back on Earth won't stand for that. We are Earth, Charlotte replied. And right now, what matters is whether we can make this work. Can we make Akapu work with us, or do we need to go home? Li Wei stood up slowly, a sinking feeling in his gut. I don't know yet. But I'm going to find out. In the coming days, Li Wei began his research in earnest. He delved deeper into the Horanqi's biology, taking samples from various parts of the rapidly spreading colony. The creatures were shockingly adaptable, able to survive in water, air, and even the extreme conditions of Akapu's underground caverns. Li Wei observed that they didn't just live, they transformed. In places where they had taken root, the landscape itself was changing, new vegetation had sprouted, the atmosphere thickened with a humid, fertile quality. Li Wei realized, with a mix of awe and fear, that the Horanqi were not just invasive, they were reshaping the planet itself. Their rapid evolution and environmental manipulation seemed to suggest something more profound. The creatures were attempting to reconfigure Akapu into a new kind of world, a world built to accommodate them and humans. They were nothing more than intruders in this alien ecosystem, but was it too late to coexist? Li Wei wasn't sure yet, but his study of the creatures had given him one unsettling conclusion: we might not be the invaders. We might be the problem. The days following Li Wei's revelation passed in a blur. As much as the colony tried to stabilize, the Horanqi were spreading faster than anyone had predicted. The crops, once meticulously cultivated, were now buried under a dense layer of writhing, pulsating green masses. Even the once sterile atmosphere was thick with spores that floated like mist in the air, making it difficult to breathe without a mask. It was as if the planet itself had decided to push back against the human intrusion. Li Wei spent hours in his lab, analyzing the samples he'd collected. He was particularly struck by the way the creature's genetic material seemed to be in constant flux, constantly adapting, almost anticipating changes in their environment. The speed at which they evolved was unlike anything he had ever seen. No other organism, not even on Earth, could compete with the rate at which the Horanqi developed new survival strategies. It was as if they were made for one purpose: to thrive in this place, to reshape it into something entirely their own, and yet, there was a beauty in it. An undeniable brilliance. He found himself in awe, despite the danger they presented. The planet Akapu, once thought of as a pristine and untouched paradise, was now being turned into something entirely alien, and it was doing so in real time, right in front of his eyes. But beauty and danger didn't mix well. And the colony's leadership was growing impatient. In the emergency meetings that followed the initial outbreak, the pressure on Li Wei to come up with a solution was unbearable. He was the one who had been tasked with studying the Horanqi, after all. And now, he was the one who had to fix this mess. "Li, you've had your time," Simon Drake said, his voice cold, cutting through the tension of the command center. "We don't have any more luxury for studying them. We need to eradicate them, and fast. There's no other way." Li Wei's eyes narrowed. "And what happens if we do that? What's left of the ecosystem once we've wiped them out? We don't even understand what they are." "I understand what they are," Ferris Kadir interrupted, his face hard as granite. "They're a threat. They've already destroyed our crops, our water sources. If we don't act now, we lose everything. What if they're the planet's natural defense mechanism?" Li Wei said, his voice rising with a mix of frustration and growing conviction. "What if this entire ecosystem is in a delicate balance, and we've just triggered the next phase of its evolution? What happens if we destroy it all?" Kadir was unmoved. "It's not our job to protect Akapu's natural balance. It's our job to make this colony thrive. And right now, that means removing the threat. I don't care how many papers you've written on the subject. The bottom line is simple: if we don't act fast, we're all dead." Li Wei's hand clenched into a fist, but he forced himself to stay calm. He knew Kadir was right, in a sense. The colony was in jeopardy. Yet, something gnawed at him, something that told him if they chose destruction, they'd be condemning themselves to repeat the same mistakes that humans had made on Earth. He thought of the ways humanity had polluted their own planet, and now here they were, on a new world, threatening to do the same thing all over again. They had been so sure of their superiority, so certain that they could control Akapu, but nature never cared for human arrogance. "Look," Li Wei said after a long silence, "I don't have a solution. Not yet. But there's one thing I do know. We can't just destroy everything here. There's something valuable in these creatures, something that we need to understand. Not just for the sake of Akapu, but for the sake of humanity. We've been so busy trying to conquer every new world we land on, we've forgotten what it means to live in harmony with nature." Simon Drake snorted. "Harmony? You're talking about a species that's currently choking the life out of our colony. We need to think practically, Li." "I am thinking practically," Li Wei shot back. "We don't have to destroy everything. We just need to learn to coexist." Charlotte Vance, who had been silent up until that point, spoke up. "I think he might be right," she said, her voice low but firm. "I've been thinking about it, too. These creatures are different. They're not like any pest species we've encountered before. They're more like a force of nature." "Force of nature?" Kadir scoffed. "What does that even mean? Do you want to just let them destroy us?" "I'm not saying that," Charlotte replied. "But we have to stop thinking in terms of total domination. Maybe we need to try something else. Maybe we need to find a way to work with them. Understand them." Li Wei seized on her words. "Exactly. If we learn how they're able to manipulate the environment, maybe we can use that knowledge to our advantage. Maybe we can find a way to control the spread, make sure they don't overwhelm the colony." Kadir, seeing the shifting tide in the room, finally relented, but only slightly. "Fine. But we don't have time for your research to save us. If you can't prove to me that these things can be controlled in the next 24 hours, we're going with the terraform plan. No more discussions. Li Wei felt a cold wave of anxiety wash over him. He had no answers yet, but he couldn't give up now. Not when he was so close to understanding what made the Horanqi tick. He needed to get back to his lab. The next few days were a blur of data, experiments, and desperate observations. Li Wei, along with Charlotte and Simon, roamed the colony, trying to track the spread of the Horanqi, taking samples, recording their mutations. The more he learned about the creatures, the more he realized how much he still didn't understand. The Horanqi were multiplying at a mind-boggling rate. What was even more disturbing was their ability to adapt in real time. In some cases, Li Wei found, they would change their form to better match the environment. A section of the colony that had been flooded with water intended as a quarantine zone was soon populated with a new breed of Horanqi that had evolved to thrive in aquatic conditions. The creatures could breathe underwater. And, worse yet, they could move freely from the water to the land. It was as if Akapu had been waiting for something to trigger its hidden potential, and humanity's arrival had been the catalyst. And now, everything was accelerating. The ecological system was shifting, reorganizing itself around these rapidly evolving creatures. Li Wei stayed up late into the night, staring at the holographic data, trying to find some clue, some thread of a solution. His mind was clouded with questions. Was it possible to stop this? Or was this an inevitable consequence of humans trying to tame a wild, foreign world? Could they coexist with a species that was literally rewriting the laws of nature? As he sat there, exhausted and uncertain, the door to his lab slid open. Charlotte entered, looking haggard but resolute. Any progress? She asked quietly, as though already knowing the answer. Li Wei sighed and rubbed his eyes. "I've found something, but I'm not sure if it's a breakthrough or just more of the same. The Horanqi seem to be almost sentient, Charlotte. It's not just random mutation anymore. They're adapting in ways that suggest intelligence." Charlotte frowned. "What do you mean, intelligence?" I think they're learning. And if they're learning, they might be aware of us. They might understand that we're a threat. Or maybe they see us as a resource," she said, her voice trailing off. Li Wei's heart sank. That was a possibility he hadn't considered fully. If the Horanqi were aware of humans, if they had any kind of self-preservation instinct, the stakes had just changed completely. The room fell silent, both of them lost in their thoughts. The solution, whatever it might be, was slipping further and further away. But there was one thing Li Wei knew for sure now: time was running out and they couldn't afford to get it wrong. The next few hours felt like a blur. Li Wei couldn't shake the feeling that the Horanqi were more than just an ecological anomaly. If they were truly aware of humans, if they could perceive them as a threat, as Charlotte had suggested, then this wasn't just an invasion of space. This was a battle for control of the planet itself. Li Wei's thoughts kept spiraling. He couldn't stop imagining the way the creatures had adapted, their rapid evolution, the patterns they seemed to follow. He spent the night in his lab, reviewing his data, but nothing made sense. The deeper he dug, the more questions arose. Were the Horanqi acting independently, or were they part of a larger, more interconnected system? Could they communicate? Or were they acting purely on instinct? He was jolted from his thoughts by a sharp knocking on the lab door. Charlotte's voice came through. "Li, we need to talk. Now." He stood up quickly, disoriented from the lack of sleep, and walked to the door. She looked just as exhausted as he felt, but there was something different in her eyes, something urgent. "We've got a problem," she said, her voice tight. "The terraformers are getting ready to move forward. They're going to start deploying the first wave of toxins tomorrow. They've made their decision. We have 1 day." Li Wei's stomach churned. "What do you mean, deploying toxins? What exactly are they planning to do?" Charlotte pulled up a digital map of the colony, highlighting the areas designated for terraforming. "They're going to release a mix of chemicals designed to kill off the Horanqi and the entire surrounding ecosystem. It's their only plan for containment. Li Wei blinked, trying to wrap his mind around it. You're telling me they're going to destroy everything? The whole ecosystem? Yeah, that's the idea, Charlotte said, her voice cold. They're going to wipe it out. Then they'll try to repopulate with Earth-compatible species. It's brutal, but they think it'll work. Li Wei felt a wave of nausea. He couldn't let this happen. Not after everything he'd seen. But at the same time, he didn't know how to stop it. If the terraformers were this far along, he had no leverage. The clock was ticking, and his research was barely a fraction of what was needed to understand the creatures, let alone find a solution. What do we do? Li Wei asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. I don't know. But if we don't act fast, we're all done for. We're not going to get another chance after tomorrow. We either stop the terraformers or we lose everything. Li Wei finished for her. Charlotte nodded, her face tight. We have to figure out a way to make them listen. They'll never halt the terraformers unless we give them something they can't ignore. Li Wei thought for a moment. The terraformers weren't going to listen to their pleas. Not without hard proof. He had no way of knowing what that proof would look like, but there was one thing he did know: the Horanqi were intelligent. They were learning. There had to be a way to communicate with them. A thought flickered into his mind, a fragile, half-formed idea that seemed absurd in its ambition. It was risky, but it was all they had. Charlotte, he said slowly, I need you to help me with something. It's dangerous, but it might just work. The next morning, Li Wei and Charlotte stood on the outskirts of the rapidly spreading infestation. The air was thick with spores, making it difficult to see clearly. A sense of desperation hung in the air, but Li Wei was resolute. He had a plan. If he was right, if his theory about the Horanqi's intelligence held true, then there might still be a way to stop the terraformers. He'd learned one key thing over the last few days: the Horanqi didn't just spread randomly. They reacted to stimuli. He had observed their response to environmental changes, but there was something else, something he hadn't fully considered until now. What if they were responding to human presence specifically? What if they were able to sense and recognize the difference between humans and other life forms? Li Wei had a theory that the Horanqi were like a collective organism, capable of perceiving threats, but also capable of forming intricate patterns of behavior that suggested a kind of intelligence. What if, instead of attacking them, he could find a way to signal them? He didn't know if it would work, but it was their only chance. You sure about this? Charlotte asked, eyeing the swarms of creatures that seemed to writhe with increasing energy. I have to try, Li Wei replied, setting up his equipment. The plan was simple. In theory, they would use electromagnetic pulses, low-frequency signals that could mimic the natural rhythm of the Horanqi's movement. Li Wei hypothesized that the creatures could interpret these pulses as communication. It was a long shot, but they didn't have time to waste. I'm activating the signal now, he said, fingers hovering over the console. Charlotte gave him a wary glance. You sure you want to do this out here? What if they go crazy? They already are crazy, Li Wei muttered under his breath. With a steady hand, he pressed a button. At first, nothing happened. But then, the ground beneath them began to tremble. It was subtle at first, like a faint rumble far below the surface. But soon, the vibration intensified. And then, without warning, the Horanqi responded. It wasn't like the chaotic, indiscriminate spread they'd seen before. This time, the creatures seemed to be moving toward the signal, not away from it. The writhing masses began to form clusters, slowly gathering in concentric patterns around the area where Li Wei and Charlotte stood. The creatures were drawn to the pulse, almost as if they were following a trail. Li Wei's heart pounded in his chest. This was exactly what he had hoped for. The creatures weren't just reacting, they were listening. They were responding to the signal as though it was something they could understand. As the creatures closed in, the air grew thick with the scent of their spore clouds. Li Wei could see the translucent bodies shimmering in the light, their delicate forms moving in perfect synchronization. For the first time, he saw them not as an infestation, but as a living, breathing system, each creature working in harmony with the others, adapting and shifting as one. "Charlotte," Li Wei said, his voice trembling with awe, "I think it's working." But before he could say anything more, a loud crash echoed across the colony. The terraformers had begun their operation. There was no turning back now. The Horanqi were responding, but the threat of destruction loomed over them all. "What now?" Charlotte asked, her voice rising in panic. "We need to communicate with them," Li Wei said, his mind racing. "We need to make them understand that we're not a threat. If they're listening to us, then maybe we can find a way to coexist." But just as he finished speaking, the ground shook violently, and the first wave of terraformers arrived. They were equipped with large, mechanized suits and terraforming pods designed to exterminate the Horanqi. The air grew thick with chemical fumes, and the creatures recoiled from the onslaught. Li Wei's stomach churned as he watched the creatures writhe in pain. But he didn't give up. There had to be a way to stop this madness. He began adjusting the frequency of the pulse, trying to get the creatures to understand, to push back, and then, something extraordinary happened. The Horanqi began to form a protective barrier around the terraformers, surrounding them in an impenetrable wall of shifting, pulsating green masses. The terraformers' weapons faltered against the wall of organic material, their chemicals ineffective against the creatures' rapid adaptation. Li Wei's eyes widened in shock and disbelief. "It's working," he whispered. "They're protecting us." As the terraformers struggled to break through the barrier, Li Wei realized that the creatures weren't just defending themselves. They were defending themselves and humanity. Somehow, in their instinct to survive, the Horanqi had recognized that their existence and the human colony were now inextricably linked. They had responded to the signal not with aggression, but with defense. In that moment, Li Wei knew that they could survive together. They didn't have to destroy everything. They could find a way to coexist, if only they could prove to the terraformers that the Horanqi weren't just pests, they were part of Akapu's future. And for the first time, Li Wei felt a glimmer of hope. The end.